Hello, and welcome to How the Grid Works. This is a set of conversations where we learn about the many different systems that make up the electrical grid by talking to people who have worked on them and have firsthand experience with those systems. I'm Holly, I'm your question asker. I am a former SpaceX engineer where I worked on interconnection for the electrical system for Dragon and Starship, so kind of the grid of those vehicles. Today, I have with me Therese Miranda-Blackney, who has a diverse history of working in energy and working on the grid, and now runs her own consultancy around strategy for the clean energy transition, and whose sister I also happen to work with briefly at SpaceX. Therese, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Holly. I'm excited.
And this is our inaugural trial run of this, so thanks for experimenting with me too. Can you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about kind of your experience, what you've done, what you've worked on, and then what you're doing now?
Sure. So my clean energy journey started way back in college when I went into the survey class for my major, thinking I would do anything besides the energy and environment concentration. And it is the only thing I've ever done in my career. I started out in DC working on policy in the think tank world, and then did some federal government consulting to military agencies and other players in the federal space about their energy usage and how they could be more strategic about it. And then I went to grad school and got a MBA and a master's in environmental science, which kind of brought me out into the utility world. So I worked at Puget Sound Energy here in Seattle for almost 6 years, where I launched new customer facing programs and set up our DER strategy, figured out how we were going to make all of these small scale things fit into an organization that was really used to thinking about large utility scale energy, but wanted to figure out how to change and innovate to meet the needs of the future. And then I took a stint into startup land. So I worked at Level 10 Energy, where I led their innovation team, and then at Shifted Energy, which is a distributed energy platform using water heaters to provide grid services. As you mentioned, I run my own consulting firm now, helping companies figure out how to get more clean energy out there.
So what have been like one or two of your favorite projects to work on?
Okay. The one that always has a place in my heart is the community solar program we launched at Puget Sound Energy. It went through a lot of hands. It was not my project alone, because it took us probably close to 6 years to actually get it out the door. But it's one of those where we really got to put together all the pieces and figure out how to build something that was going to be really exciting to the participants, and also allow some of our lower income and more vulnerable populations to participate in a meaningful way.
And can you give an overview for people who don't know, what is community solar? And I know you also talked about DER, distributed energy resources. How would you define distributed energy resources, and how do those two connect?
Yeah, so community solar looks a little different depending on where you are. The program we built at Puget Sound Energy is a utility run program. So the utility kind of manages all of the solar installations, manages the subscription to it. Customers can buy in for a monthly subscription fee, and then they get a credit on their bill every month based on how much solar energy their share of the project produces. A lot of what had existed in Washington before this program was all upfront buy-in. So you had to come up with a couple $1,000s to buy your share of the project. So when we were putting this together, it was really important to me that we do it in a more accessible kind of monthly fee way, where the entry point became a lot more approachable for people. And then you asked about DERs.
Yeah, just at a high level, what are DERs and how have you worked on DERs differently than community solar?
Yeah, so DERs, distributed resources, kind of covers a large range of things, but I tend to think of it as anything that is connected to the distribution part of the system. So that part of the grid that's kind of touching your house or your business, where the loads are located, where energy is being consumed. So it might be things like rooftop solar or residential batteries. I also think of DERs as including managed charging from electric vehicles, or a smart thermostat program, or behavioral demand response, which isn't really a resource, but is providing a grid service.
Yeah. Okay, so if we zoom out a little bit, because you have this like really excellent systems view of the whole grid, and the grid is, there are many grids in the United States, and we have microgrids, and then we have like regional grids. How would you define the grid, and what are some of the pieces that make up the grid?
Sure. So I think to me, the grid is everything that it takes to get electricity from where it is created to where it is used. And that means a lot of physical infrastructure. It's things like transmission lines, generation facilities, substations, but it also means a lot of people and software and kind of technical know-how that goes into keeping all of that balanced in real time. Because one of the really unique things about electricity is it has to be in constant supply and demand balance, which makes the system really susceptible to interruptions and complicated.
Yeah, and for me at least, like the fact that this is a technological, like giant system, but it's also a system that has these layers of like people and money that all have to work well together is part of what makes it so interesting. Are there like systems within that broader system that stand out to you as like particularly difficult pain points, or that operate in kind of like a counterintuitive way that might surprise people?
Yeah, so I think for a long time, right, we kind of operated the grid as energy flows from the generation plant through the transmission system, down through a substation, and out into the distribution system. Mm-hmm. And I think where things get complicated and confusing now is where we start trying to bring in new technology that changes that paradigm and changes the way the electrons are flowing through the system and how they're getting distributed, because that's complicated from a physical infrastructure perspective, and there's a lot of protections built in the system around the assumption that power is flowing one way, not two ways. Mm-hmm. But it's also complicated from a people perspective and a change management perspective. And you're asking system operators to think about things in a really different way and to optimize for a new goal.
So with that in mind, you've done a lot of work around distributed, like a more distributed approach, mm-hmm. Which is a trend that I think anybody who's starting to get interested in the grid will immediately start hearing about. Can you speak to like why people are interested in a distributed approach, and like whether you think it makes sense with respect to some of these pain points?
Yeah, I think I am definitely a both and person on this. I do not think large scale utility plants and transmission infrastructure are going away anytime soon. I think there are great economies of scale and benefits that come from utility scale wind farms and solar projects and large batteries. And I think transmission is really hard to build. And we have pretty high growing electrification demands when you factor in things like data centers and AI, sure, but also electrifying all of our heating systems, electrifying our transportation system, right? So you've got this upward growth in the system, and it's happening fast, and we need resources that can support that. And so the thing that I have always thought is really cool about the distributed system is because it's smaller, because it's these individual decisions and these individual properties kind of moving things forward, you can often move a lot faster, and you can deploy the same volume of resource across 1,000 sites in a way that doesn't impact some of these grid systems the same way putting a single 1,000 megawatt site might.
So to like visualize this a bit, so for those who don't know, transmission is the long distance, very high voltage lines. All of the grid has extremely stringent safety regulations, and like you said, it has to always be operational. So it has high reliability requirements. And so transmission is really difficult to build, and a big pain point in our, like, as I understand it, a big pain point in increasing in the electrification goals people have. And then distribution is different from transmission. Distribution is the more localized level at like more of a medium voltage, I guess, whether it's medium or still high or low depends on, is relative. But distribution is the lines that are, for example, running along the street and kind of that last mile or just before the last wires that get to your home, correct?
Yep.
And so that's where you see some of the opportunity for like faster paced innovation, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about it, right, is if you look at utility bills and what you're paying for when you pay for your energy through your power company, about 25, it depends where you are, but about 25% of that is the cost of actually generating the electrons. The rest of it is the cost of that transmission and distribution system and what goes into delivering the power to your house. So one of the interesting things about co-locating generation with the places that are consuming energy is it decreases how much you actually have to use that distribution grid. And there's nuance to that. And there are times when adding a distributed resource can increase stress on the grid. But if you're thoughtful about where you're putting them, what resources you're putting in, and how you are managing them, you can actually get a lot more out of our existing infrastructure.
That makes sense. And this is the both and piece, because if you're storing a lot of energy at scale or generating, if you're storing a lot of energy in one place or generating a lot of energy in one place, you can leverage some of these like economies of scale, operating more efficiently, but that comes with higher distribution and transmission costs. But then if you do everything locally, like microgrids, I've heard can be more like hardware intensive per like power, per watt or kilowatt or whatever you're measuring it in. So it's kind of like finding these trade-offs. Is that a fair understanding?
Definitely. And I think, right, like there's also real space constraints. Like you could cover every rooftop in Seattle with solar panels, but it wouldn't necessarily serve the energy consumption needs of Seattle in the hours when people want to consume energy, because we like to use our lights when it's dark out and we like to run our heat when it's cold out. And those are hours when that solar typically isn't generating. So you need to bring in other solutions and other technologies to help keep everything balanced and operating.
And so like we use energy everywhere in the country. Like, so like to what extent are there standard approaches that are kind of like one size fits all or fits many? And to what extent is there's like a very localized set of solutions?
So one of the things I think that makes the energy system really challenging in the US is how disparate our regulation is. So every state has their own utility commission that's setting rules for how their utilities can set rates, what they're allowed to do. We have numerous regional transmission operating systems and integrated system operators, kind of the people who manage the transmission system and how power flows through that. Washington has I think it's over 40 utilities just in the state, and each of those utilities have their own rules. And then many local jurisdictions have their own policies about permitting. So the rules for what your solar installation looks like in one city could be very different than what is permittable in another city. And so that complexity is a lot of what adds to the soft costs we see here that you don't necessarily see in other parts of the world.
And are there localities, municipalities or utility districts that stand out to you as like maybe more adaptable or doing something interesting and like, or have a regulatory structure that lends itself to some of these distributed approaches?
Yeah, so I think a lot of where you've seen kind of interesting movement on the distributed side of things has definitely been driven through regulatory mandates. So you've got, interesting things happening in California, New York, Connecticut, coming out of some of their state level policies and goals. Colorado just mandated that the state develop a virtual power plant program. And so that's driving a lot of discussion and innovation. I also think the 100% clean energy policies that you have in a number of states, Washington, Oregon, other places across the US, drive some of this decision too, because when you start putting those deadlines out there for when you need to be hitting these large clean energy numbers, it starts to really drive that conversation about risk and trade-off, and is the large scale stuff going to show up in time, and can you balance and deliver the large scale stuff without doing some of this distributed stuff? So that was a lot of my role at PSE, was building that strategy around how these small things fit into that narrative.
Yeah. Let's see. Were there are there like particular innovations that you've worked on that are especially exciting to you, whether for a specific locality or more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because there's innovation that comes in the form of like policy and nudges and things behind the scenes that make it easier to do these things. And then there's kind of the innovative technology side of it. One of the pieces that I think is really interesting and getting a lot more attention across the US right now is shared batteries. So basically, right, either a bring your own battery program where you as a customer who have installed the battery can allow the utility to use part of it and they can provide grid services out of that. You still get your backup power and benefits from that. You get paid for doing that. And that interacts with the grid in a really different way than putting like a single battery at a substation or co-located with a renewable energy project. They bring really different benefits to the grid. Because a substation level battery might give you some outage prevention for that circuit, depending on where the outage occurs and what's going on behind it. A battery in your home is always going to give you outage protection because it's there. So I think those models are really interesting. We're also seeing a few more models where utilities are directly deploying and owning those batteries. So Green Mountain Power, right, is the kind of originator of this. They've been doing it for probably 10 years at this point. They will lease their customers a Tesla Powerwall for their house, and in exchange for the ability to use it for some grid services as well.
And so just to clarify, so this idea is that you put batteries near the load. So you put it near the residences or the factories, rather than putting it near the generation, where maybe it stores the energy before it reaches the distribution system. And then if the distribution system goes down, you don't have access to it. Whereas if it's at your house and the power goes out, your house is connected to that battery. And so you still have access to that power.
Yeah. And the distribution, like the substation sided battery, right, is going to be really valuable from kind of managing that distribution system flow and keeping things balanced there and preventing, maybe if you have like a bunch of solar on rooftops, you don't really want that flowing back onto the transmission system usually. So you could use a substation level battery to store that excess solar during the middle of the day and then push it back out as demand starts coming up in the evening.
Yeah.
It's just a different set of benefits. And that's part of why I don't know that I could pick a winner in this space. I think we need it all and we need more of all of it.
Well, and this is one of the interesting pieces about the energy space, as I understand it right now, is that there is so much work that needs to be done that it's very much like, yes, and like, let's try everything and have everybody like add their piece to be like the puzzle that is missing a lot of pieces right now.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting in the context of like climate and how we achieve these aggressive climate goals that require a lot of money, right? There is a lot of investment that needs to be made to drive these changes. And I think there's a very real and open question about where that money should come from and how you drive that investment. And one of the interesting things about customer-sided programs is often that money is coming from the homeowner, either directly if they buy their system outright or indirectly because they're leasing it through a third-party leasing program. And so that changes that calculus. It's not necessarily going into utility rates, which spreads out who's paying for the transition in a different way than putting it into a centralized cost.
And do you see that as a like practical or sustainable approach moving forward? It seems like there's a lot of pain points in the energy system where people would be like financially incentivized to pay for a better system. Like fire prevention is another one.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation, right? Because it kind of feels like in some ways you're letting the wealthy people who have money create their own little green system. And if you're not careful about how those incentives are structured, everybody else on the grid is paying for that transition. The other way of looking at it is if they weren't generating renewable energy, if they weren't bringing these resources onto the grid, the utility would have to pay for that, and that would get spread out to all ratepayers. And so making sure that those incentives and structures are put together in a way that actually drives the outcomes you're looking for and creates a fair and equitable energy transition, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that anyone has all the answers and that we figure it out, and the numbers come out differently, right? Depending on who runs the analysis, either solar is the best thing ever for the grid, or it's absolutely destroying the grid and going to create a death spiral. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of like players and systems in our energy system, in our grids. How do you see like decisions getting made and people working together, whether it's technically or economically or in the regulatory space?
Yeah. So you've probably picked this up by now. I am like at my heart a policy nerd. It's what happens when you study international affairs in college. It sticks with you forever.
I love it.
So I think there's a lot of like underlying policy and incentive that drives it, but then that trickles out into economic incentives and wholesale power markets and the price signals that get sent through the system. So one of the like really cool things about our energy system is it's largely set up so that if something goes wrong, if a resource trips offline, if a power plant has an issue, it sends a price signal out to the whole grid and basically says, hey, I will pay you a lot to turn on right now because I don't want to have to cause an outage. And so those financial structures, right, then drive what's happening in real time on the grid and what's turning on and what resources are getting used and how the utilities are thinking about dispatching, or the ISOs, depending on where you are thinking about dispatching resources. But under that price signal is all of these people who are the ones who are actually making the decisions, interpreting what the software is saying, looking at it, deciding what resources to trade for. And that's kind of in that real-time instantaneous operation piece of it. There's also all of this thinking that happens about long-term. What are the things we need to be deploying? How are we evolving our grid? How do we think about these investment decisions? So like I love talking about non-wires alternatives and how do you look at a distribution? This is like if you have substation and distribution feeders that are going to need upgrades because they're getting close to their capacity or they're getting towards the end of life in terms of age of the equipment. What are you going to do there? And one of the recent trends is utilities will assess an alternative to just rebuilding the wires. So they'll look at what could I deploy in this circuit to help it better manage the load and the demand on it. So we did a couple projects with this with PSE where we were looking at like targeted demand response and higher incentives for customers who were participating in demand response on some of these circuits. We were looking at deploying batteries. We were kind of trying to piece all these things together and say, could you do it cheaper this way than running new wires? And those decisions are kind of separate from the day-to-day operations. But if we're doing it well, they're linking together and we're building the bridges that we need for the day-to-day operators to be able to use those solutions in the future.
And so those examples that you just gave of batteries and different demand response incentives, those are kind of making better use of the wires that already do exist. Is that what you mean by non-wires alternatives?
Yeah. And so one of the things that maybe doesn't get talked about enough with the grid is we build the system to a really extreme standard. So the system's kind of built to handle the hottest summer day or the coldest winter day and the energy demand that comes with that, and factor in an N-1 or N-2 contingency. So if you
what is N-1 or N-2?
Yeah, so if you have one or two things go wrong on the system, can you still keep the power on? So most days, there is a lot of excess capacity on the grid. So what you're really trying to do is figure out how you can kind of smooth things out, make things flatter, make them less peaky, and fill up the pipes that are the wires of the grid to 100% more often, or to 70% more often.
Yeah. It's interesting, like somebody I was talking to was framing it as, I think there's a lot of comparisons between like the internet and like an information network and how that's built out, especially if we start talking about distributed models or designs. And then like the power system and power and information are very different to distribute in the first place. But the power system is something that we have one already right now. Like we're not building a new system the way we built a new internet, in the past few decades. And it's been around for like 150 years or so. Like we've built it over a really long time. And so we have this kind of like cobbled together system that we can't turn off at any point, just to like replace everything the way you might with other like less safety critical projects. And so I guess like my question in here is around like, how do we, like, what does a grid of the future look like if, from your perspective, if like we do a really excellent job 15 or 20 years from now, what does that look like? And how do we get there from where we are right now? Everything goes right. Like you get the most optimistic situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the grid of the future has a few things that are true about it. I think there is a lot more information coming out of it than we have today. And that the amount of information we have today is just exponentially more than we had, 10 years ago when I started working at a utility. Smart meters and things like that have really changed how we understand what's happening at the grid at any given point. And then there's a whole bunch of kind of distribution automation happening and increase in kind of transmission level data. So you just have more insight into what's happening on the grid at any given point. And I think that helps make better decisions, and it helps make some of these distributed automated responses more feasible. Because I don't think the grid of the future is like me sitting here every morning and being like, okay, here's the power price forecast for my house, and here's what I'm going to bid in for what I want to provide to the grid. Like I'm a total energy nerd and I have no desire to do that. I think if we are going to successfully use distributed resources, it has to be kind of seamless and invisible and non-burdensome to the people whose devices we're asking to use.
So the financial equivalent there would be, rather than like trading stocks manually, having like an automated index fund or something that's doing the evaluation for you and making the decisions for you.
Yeah, right. Basically, it's me saying like, look, I want to make sure my car is charged this amount by 9 a.m. when I leave for work. Do whatever you want with it before then.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of interesting companies out there right now kind of working on how you create that more seamless customer experience. And provide those price signals. I think we have to be thoughtful about how we structure those signals. There's a lot of interesting research coming out right now where if you switch to kind of bulk time of use rates where, anything you use 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. or whatever the window is for your utility, right, is super discounted in a highly automated system, you create this risk that you create a new secondary peak and everyone's timer, right, kicks on right when that off peak period starts. And so now you've actually put a bunch of stress on the distribution system when you were trying to avoid that stress. So I think that's an area where collaboration with utilities and really bringing them to the table and talking to them about what problems it is they're trying to solve is a really important piece of it. I think I'm biased in this because I worked at a utility, but I think there's a lot of tendency among startups in particular to just view utilities as kind of these stubborn dinosaurs who are just get in the way of what you're trying to do. And there are certainly utilities out there that fit that lens, but I just don't see a future of the grid where utilities are not around and they're not part of the solution.
Why fundamentally is that?
It's such a massive, complex system. It needs an operator. It's not going to self-operate.
The way like a privatized approach might require it to, if it were to be sustainable. So I'm interested then with like, there's this tension that I've seen between the need to move really fast and upgrade things really fast and innovate quickly. I heard one person put it as like we built the grid we have in the last 150 years, and we have another like 10 or 15 to rebuild the whole thing. How that plays with this need to both the need to move slow enough that we can be sure that we're doing things safely and reliably, but also working with people who are just used to doing things that way and maybe not as accustomed to the like rapid startup style pace of change. Do you see collaboration there between those two sides?
Yeah, I think there's ways to get there. I think there's some really, and this is not my area of expertise, but I think there's some really interesting work being done with kind of digital twins and kind of letting you model out the impact of some of these changes without making them directly on the grid system that can help build confidence that you're not going to cause a cascading outage or something if these things happen. I think the other piece of it is a lot of the distributed stuff the utilities don't actually control, right? Like people are going to buy electric vehicles if they're going to buy electric vehicles, and they're going to charge them at their house. And we as the utility didn't know who had bought an electric vehicle or when they were going to start plugging it in. And so there's kind of a forcing function where consumer demand and consumer behavior forces the utilities to upgrade the grid, right? If the transformer on your street blows because you and your 5 neighbors all bought EVs and started charging them, the utility is going to come out and replace it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that the most systematic, effective way of doing those upgrades? Probably not. There's a lot of work going into trying to forecast adoption trends and figure out where those upgrades need to be made proactively. There was something else I was going to say, and I lost my train of thought.
That happens to me a lot. It sounds like the way you're framing it sounds like this transition to be more distributed is kind of inevitable, because like at the end of the day, we can't control, nor should we, every single person, and people are going to make the decisions that they make. And when they have the opportunity to like try an electrified induction stove that frankly is better than the gas equivalent, like that's gonna happen. How do we like lean into that energy, pun intended?
Yeah, it's funny. I was at a electrification panel earlier this week. And one of the things I kind of walked out, one of the questions was like, how do we get more people to adopt these technologies? And I think it's exactly what you said, right? Like we make them technologies that are appealing to some reason beyond energy, because the vast majority of people are not energy nerds like us, and they don't really care about the kilowatt hours that they're going to save by switching to a heat pump or the tons of CO2 avoided by that change. They care about like, does it keep my house warm, and can I install it easily in my house, and what's it going to do to my bill? And so I think when you look at the technologies that have had kind of really fast consumer uptake, when you look at solar panels, they have a financial benefit to them in most places. When you look at the Nest thermostat, right, that's just a better user experience than your old school thermostat. When you look at electric vehicles, most of that adoption is people who think they're fun to drive and cool, not people who are, and climate is part of it. It's a considering factor, but it's not the only thing that's driving that choice. So that's something I think a lot about. It's like, how do we make these energy technologies just interesting in their own right and not because of their grid potential? But then as you deploy them, how do you make sure you're capturing that grid potential and you're going to be able to use those resources in an effective way to manage the grid?
And do you think we have answers to that second piece right now?
I think we have pieces of it. I think we know that it has to be convenient. It has to be easy. It has to be financially worthwhile. And I think there's a lot of interesting work happening there. I think we're still very much at the early stages of figuring out what that engagement looks like and how you scale beyond some of the early adopters of these programs.
Mm-hmm. So do you think we will, I guess like prediction is only so useful, but do you think we will kind of figure this out as we move forward? Do you think everything will fall apart and the outages will increase, or do you think people will start to really find ways to work together and whether it's not needing new wires in the first place or laying down new wires, figure that out?
I am a big believer that necessity is the mother of invention. And I think when you start getting strain, when you start getting pressure, when utilities start looking at their planning outlooks and seeing, 80% of their circuits in need of upgrades in the next 5 years, that starts to bring a lot of creativity to the table and encourage people to think outside the box and look at existing policies and say, is this actually serving our needs today, or is this a legacy of an era we're not operating in anymore? I think the other thing that people sometimes forget about utilities is that they actually have this really strong crisis mobilization, crisis response, a muscle from storms and outages. And there is this incredible mentality at a utility during a major storm event where it is just all hands on deck pulling together to get the grid up again, to get things working again, to get people's electricity back on. Everything basically stops, right? And even like your desk workers like me get pulled into helping with that response. And so I think there's some parallel to the idea of keeping the grid up and operating that I think you can kind of tap into and mobilize at a lot of these places.
Yeah, I think that, like, in a simplest form, that sounds very like humans rallying together, and is encouraging that there is like the energy there and the capability there. And it kind of seems like the way you're framing it, like a matter of tapping into that potential. Are there any like takeaways you'd like to leave people with, or things we didn't cover that you wanted to get to?
I think maybe my takeaway is that we come up with the best solutions when we remember that everybody who's involved in them needs to get something out of it. When we're trying to craft solutions that funnel all of the benefit to just one party or just focus on one group of people, I think that's where you see a lot of these kind of loud, dragged out fights in the energy industry happening. And so the more we can view this as we're all coming together, we all want what's best for the climate, for the grid, for our energy system. And yeah, we come at it from different perspectives. We bring different priorities. We have different financial incentives. But at the end of the day, like most people I have worked with in this industry really want us to have a functional, clean energy system.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, I agree. The people that I've talked to in the energy space have largely been in it because they want to like bring the benefit to other people. And it sounds like you're talking about kind of finding win-wins. It's a lot easier to make a transition that everybody who needs to take action on to make it happen benefits from having it happen.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah. Cool. So if people are interested in learning more about the grid as larger system or about the policy side of the grid, are there like resources that you'd recommend people look to? And then also like what services do you provide and what sorts of people should reach out to you if they're interested in following up?
Yeah, so I think there's a ton of great resources out there. I focus less on the technical side of things. My focus is really kind of the business policy side of it. So I really love like most of the podcasts coming out of Latitude Media as a way to kind of keep up with what's going on. Also a regulatory nerd. So I have been spending a lot of time monitoring utility dockets and trying to figure out what's going on underneath the hood, and kind of what those underlying incentives that are going to drive what the utilities are asking for in 5 years look like. In terms of what I do, my specialty is really like helping you go from, I have this idea for how I could do something related to clean energy to I have a functioning program, right? So I really specialize in that. Kind of how do I build it out? What's the market for this? Who's going to buy it? How do I price it? Who do I need involved in it? What's the regulatory system that I need behind it? So it's kind of wide ranging, but I kind of joke that my role is to take an idea and make it into a real life thing.
That's awesome.
Yeah. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Grid Future Strategies, or my profile directly, Therese Miranda-Blackney.
Awesome. Well, thanks for chatting today, Therese. This has been interesting to learn more about, especially the policy side for me. I'm definitely coming from more of a technical side. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Holly. This was a lot of fun.